Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Cindy.
Wonderful to have you. We are here talking about the Kinder Morgan Transmountain pipeline expansion and concerns in British Columbia and concerns across Canada on both sides of the equation. Can you tell us what is the compelling national objective supporting the Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion route?
The national objective is, as we said many times, creating a protected environment and growing the economy at the same time. Those are the two things that we set out as a core of what we do, of what we recognize Canadians know that we need. We need to make sure we got jobs for the future, but we also need to make sure we're protecting the environment, which means making sure that we're moving towards a transition off of fossil fuels in the long run, that makes sure we're protecting our oceans, making sure we're creating opportunities for Canadians and their families to have good work. What that means tangibly for us is that we put forward a national plan on fighting climate change, on reducing carbon emissions. We've moved forward on a historic oceans protection plan, and we're moving forward on getting our resources to market safely and securely through the Kinder Morgan pipeline. And all those things tie together as a part of the whole.
But what is it about Kinder Morgan particularly, in particular, that makes that an essential ingredient in this formula?
Okay. There's two pieces of it. First of all, we know that Canadian oil is discounted because we only have access to the US market right now, and creating more access to overseas markets will actually get a better price for jobs, for workers, for the Canadian economy on our resources. So that's one of the reasons why Alberta is so keen on not being landlocked with our oil resources. But the other piece of why the Kinder Morgan pipeline is so important is because approving that pipeline is part of what has allowed Alberta to put an absolute cap on oil sands emissions and actually move forward on putting a price on carbon, pricing carbon pollution in a way that actually will contribute towards reaching our Paris targets. So in order to get the National Climate Change Plan, to get Alberta to be part of it, and we need Alberta to be part of it, we agreed to twin an existing pipeline in order to get to market.
So that raises the question, as to when this decision was made, because when after your election, things moved very rapidly. Rachel Notley had already commenced, or was commencing, a very ambitious climate plan. She was already well down. She was on her way. You were going to Paris. Canada was setting very, very ambitious goals, and you were working very much in unison and in harmony. Was Kinder Morgan part of that equation then?
It was absolutely part of the equation. Alberta, as we know, even Rachel Notley were hopeful that the Northern Gateway pipeline out through Kitimat and the Douglas Channel and or the Kinder Morgan pipeline would move through. We looked at obviously both those projects in detail, realized that the Great Bear Rainforest and the Douglas Channel was no place to put pipelines and supertankers, but the well-serviced industrial marine environment that is the busy port of Vancouver, the Burrard Inlet that is already well served in terms of safety. We reopened the Kitsilano Coast Guard base. This was something that, when we've been having diluted bitumen go out through the Burrard Inlet for the past 30 years without significant issues. The pipeline's been there since 1953, but Dilbit has been going through for the past 30 years only. And that's something that we know that we can continue to protect.
So, this again, just coming back, were you in discussions and essentially making in your own mind a commitment that if the NEB was going to approve this, that by late 2015, you had already made the decision that if NEB approved, you were going to go ahead.
Well, it wasn't just the NEB. We created an interim process that would address some of the failings we saw of the original Conservative NEB process, which was do much more Indigenous consultation, stronger science, much more community consultation to get a better sense of what we're moving through. And it was always a question of if we could move forward responsibly on the Kinder Morgan pipeline, then Alberta would be able to be as ambitious as we needed Alberta to be and get on with the national climate change plan. And that's exactly when it ended up happening. Yes, they were linked to each other. Alberta right now is led by a premier who has done things that no premier has ever been able to do, and it was always a trade-off. He says, I will move forward on an absolute cap on oil sands emissions. I'll move forward with a price on carbon pollution, but in exchange for that, we're going to be able to get our resources to new markets. It all holds together, and that's something that was always part of our approach.
And the elections change things. As we all know from history, you can look back at Clyde Wells, the election of Clyde Wells, and what that did to the Meech Lake Accord, the election of René Lévesque. Now we've had an election in British Columbia. Things have changed. The temperature has gone up very, very rapidly. The rhetoric has gone up very rapidly. But there's also another potential change, which is that Alberta is going to have an election in 2019. If Jason Kenney comes in and tears up all of these commitments, what happens to Kinder Morgan?
There's a real challenge around that. I mean, we have created a national plan on fighting climate change that involves historic investments in our oceans, that involves getting our resources to markets through Kinder Morgan safely and securely, and involves a national price on carbon pollution. So Brad Wall, in his opposition to the national plan on climate change, has been endangering or trying to prevent that national plan from going through. Even though he likes the fact that it got pipelines approved, he doesn't like the national pricing on carbon. Similarly and frustratingly, John Horgan is actually trying to scuttle our national plan on fighting climate change. By blocking the Kinder Morgan pipeline, he's putting at risk the entire national climate change plan, because Alberta will not be able to stay on if the Kinder Morgan pipeline doesn't go through, and you will get politicians who are picking and choosing parts of the national plan they don't like. And if we don't continue to stand strongly on the national interest, the things that people don't like within the agreement, which is always filled with compromises, are going to make that there is no agreement and there is no capacity to reach our climate targets.
Let's look at the BC situation, the legal BC situation briefly. I mean, there is the doctrine of paramountcy. The federal government does have jurisdiction over fisheries and oceans. There's a fairly strong degree of opinion that this is the federal government's exclusive jurisdiction. So that the regulations that Premier Horgan wants to bring in probably would not survive. So let's give the federal government that. So let's suppose that you're successful in challenging anything that Premier Horgan throws in your way. Let's still get back to the eventuality of a potential Premier Kenney, who says, I don't care about any of this. I campaigned on canceling all of these agreements, and I'm going to do it.
Well,
where do you stand?
As we've seen from early reactions to what Brad Wall is trying to do, there is a federal backstop that will ensure that the national price on carbon pollution is applied right across the country. Whether there's a Made in Alberta plan like Rachel Notley put forward, or whether the provincial government wants nothing to do with it, as Saskatchewan is proposing, we're still going to collect the price on carbon in Saskatchewan and return that money to Saskatchewan, to folks in Saskatchewan. This is a plan that keeps the money collected from carbon pricing in the jurisdiction in which it's collected. And of course, we'd rather do it with the provincial government, But we will do it whether or not the provincial government agrees. That's within the federal jurisdiction. Just like, as you point out, approval of pipelines in the national interest and protection of our oceans is in the federal interest. And in parenthesis, I spent years spending my summers and times on the BC coast with my grandfather, who was former Minister of Fisheries. I know sailing lessons off at Jericho Beach. I know those waters well. I love the BC coast. If I thought we were putting at risk the BC coast, we wouldn't have approved of this. But part of the $1.5 billion of investments in the Oceans Protection Plan is ensuring that we are able to protect our coasts and make sure that we're doing all of this responsibly. It's easy to pick at any little corner of a policy decision that we take and take issue with it. It's when you realize that all this ties together that we see what the national interest truly is, and that's what we're standing up for.
Excluding benefits to Alberta, going back again to the compelling national objective, excluding benefits to Alberta, which it appears that almost all the financial benefits, certainly post-construction, accrue to Alberta. How does the rest of Canada benefit from this agreement?
Okay. We get a national price on carbon. We meet our Paris targets. That's a big piece of it. The next part of it is, for years, the Alberta economy and the boom in the Alberta economy supported the rest of the country. Alberta has contributed significantly to the country's economic well-being over decades, and will continue to if they have jobs, opportunity, and growth.
That economy has been struggling over the recent past, but it is in recovery. There are new projects coming online. The Fort Hills project is coming online. There is expansion happening with or without Kinder Morgan. So the question is, how essential is that piece really to your national climate plan?
If the Kinder Morgan pipeline doesn't go through, Alberta will withdraw its support for the national plan on climate change. We will not have them fighting to reach their carbon targets. We will not have them as partners in reaching our Paris targets. And we know that we need to have active leadership from across the country. Yes, the federal backstop means there will be a price on carbon right across the country regardless, but it becomes a lot more difficult when a key player like Alberta decides to turn its back on the fight against climate change. And the issue that people are overlooking is they all have to tie together. And right now, Premier Horgan's attempts to block the pipeline are exactly lined up with Brad Wall's attempts to stop a carbon tax.
The NEB process is fundamentally about safety and oil pipeline safety. It's not designed to cover the wide-ranging issues. The issue of climate change was not in its purview when this was begun. First Nations consultation is not something that is part and parcel of the NEB functions. There are a number of very key public policy issues that were not really an integral part of the NEB process. I wonder if you would comment on the limitations of the NEB process in assisting the government to make its decision when it by nature has to consider all of these other factors.
Well, I think we saw very clearly that Canadians did not trust the NEB process to actually get to the right decision and to care for our well-being and future for the long term. And that's why in the transitional phase, we had to add a lot of science, a lot of consultation, a lot of working with Indigenous communities to be able to satisfactorily approve the Kinder Morgan pipeline through a transitional process. But that's also why just days ago we announced that we are completely transforming the environmental assessment process to bring in those things that you're talking about, to make sure that people are confident that as we look at big projects, energy projects, we are taking into account climate change. We're taking into account upstream and downstream impacts. We're taking into account the voices of people who have concerns. That's something that we needed to restore in order both to get public trust in government's ability to get the right things done the right way, but also to reassure industry that there is a clear process for when they propose things, they can actually be treated fairly and not politically, and they can actually make the arguments in a way that if they make them the right ways, Canadians will accept.
Isn't that closing the barn door after the horse has bolted, though? Because and in fairness to Kinder Morgan, they are a good faith applicant. They have gone through this process. They have expended an enormous amount of their own capital to do this. And now we are saying, well, but this process was flawed. This process was flawed from the beginning, and the public feels that too.
The process that Stephen Harper set up was flawed, which is why, through a transitional process, we added to the Kinder Morgan evaluation process the kinds of consultations, the kinds of science that we are now demanding for all projects as of now with the new system. So actually we created a hybrid process where the proponent didn't have to go through all the steps from ground zero, but we layered onto it the kinds of consultations, the kinds of science that Canadians rightly expect of these projects. So we actually managed to apply a better process to get to the Kinder Morgan decision.
Would that include the ministerial panel that was struck to examine this process and to make recommendations?
The exact process I'm not entirely up on. I do know that we went through all the right steps and we got to the right decision because it holds together not just as a single project, but as part of a larger plan on fighting climate change.
There was a ministerial panel struck, which with some extremely credible members on that panel, both from an environmental and from a First Nations and from an economic point of view.
And they made a number of fairly strong recommendations and brought up some real criticisms on the process as well. And those are all things that we took into account when we approved the Kinder Morgan pipeline.
One of the things that they brought into account, and this has been somewhat troubling for me, and as you may be aware, I'm someone who has supported this project, but I am troubled by some of the issues as they are arising. Many Canadians don't know that one of the reasons that First Nations land issues always arise in British Columbia, and you will know this coming from there, but BC resource projects is because the BC government decades ago, 100 years ago, in its wisdom, decided not to sign treaties with any of the First Nations. So unlike other parts of Canada where these issues are covered over, that hasn't happened, and we have over 100 British Columbia First Nations who are all asserting land title, and their constitutional status has not been fully settled. The Supreme Court of Canada in the Chilcotin decision said that where Aboriginal title has been established, the Crown must justify any incursions on Aboriginal title by demonstrating both a compelling and substantial governmental objective, and that the government has fulfilled its fiduciary duty. And the Federal Court of Appeal quashed the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline decision, by the NEB's decision on Enbridge Northern Gateway, for inadequate consultation with First Nations. Your independent ministerial panel reviewing the NEB's Kinder Morgan approval process was quite harshly critical of the adequacy of First Nations consultation. And they cited, in my reading, almost the exact same failings that Enbridge Northern Gateway suffered from, and that were ultimately fatal. And your own government's internal memos indicate that the most affected First Nations, or most of the affected First Nations, feel that they didn't have adequate consultation. So my question is, have you obtained a legal opinion that Kinder Morgan's proposal will survive a First Nations legal challenge?
We believe that it will. We
How-
believe that it will because we have been working with, and this is one of the things, individual Indigenous communities are not monolithic. They all have different perspectives. We've got impact benefit agreements with 42 different Indigenous communities along the proposed twinning route, and they are very supportive of this pipeline. Others have concerns. Similarly, there were Indigenous communities who were very supportive of the Northern Gateway pipeline, who were disappointed that we didn't move forward on that one. So you're always going to get people with different perspectives. Our concern is, are we working with the specific communities to allay the concerns they have? And the work we're doing with the Tsleil-Waututh, with others, on, okay, what are your specific concerns? Are they about pollution? Are they about noise? Are they about disruption? Are they about benefits? We are working with each of them individually to ensure that we're listening, we're hearing their concerns, and we're working to counter those concerns, whether or not we ultimately get license from them to do it. One of the elements of the Chilcotin decision was Indigenous peoples do not have a veto over pipelines, over projects like this. They need to be consulted, they need to be engaged with, they need to be heard and listened to, and there has to be significant efforts to accommodate, to build partnerships, but there is no veto.
If I may, the Chilcotin decision doesn't give them a veto, that's very true, but it does impose a fiduciary duty on the federal government. One of the complaints that the ministerial panel has outlined in quite extensive detail is that there wasn't full disclosure, that it isn't just that the First Nations had concerns, they didn't have information. There are bands along the Fraser River who were not informed. What is the emergency spill response? How are we supposed to work with that? They couldn't get this information. I'm troubled, I'm concerned that, but the decision has already been made. And so I'm concerned that the courts are going to say that there was a failure to execute the fiduciary duty to get this information, to full consultation means full information as well, and full disclosure to the extent that that's possible. I'm concerned that your government is going to be on thin ice there.
No, we have worked with Indigenous communities who have concerns. We are giving them the tools, the information that they need. Some of them are happy and are supportive. Some continue to have concerns. We continue to work with all of them to improve the capacity, whether it's spill response, whether it's being able to continue to protect the land and respect the people on it. These are things that are integral to our government. The approach we have on reconciliation is one about respecting rights. It's a rights-based approach. There are always going to be voices who will never be satisfied or never be on board with a particular difficult project or another. What we have to do as a federal government is make sure that we are hearing those voices, respecting those voices, and acting in the interests of all Canadians, and that's exactly what we're doing here.
What's the difference between hearing the voices and going ahead and not hearing the voices and going ahead?
Well, the way you actually go ahead includes the concerns that if someone says, I'm really concerned about what might happen with a spill here, we say, okay, well, let's focus on what's going to happen and how we're going to counter those concerns. Even if it doesn't mean that you're suddenly going to say, yes, I'm happy with it now, it will allay that fear around that specific issue. And that's been a big piece of our approach on this. Okay, what are your specific concerns? Look how we're allaying those concerns. People are mentioning concerns around the southern resident killer whale pod, for example. Well, there's noise reduction. We've committed to no net new noise. We've committed to looking for habitat protections, looking at how we're going to ensure food supplies. These are the things that we know we have to do. Now, just because we do all the things to create better protections for marine mammals doesn't mean everyone's going to be convinced that the project is a good one, but everyone can be reassured that we are doing more to address their concerns.
One of the primary roles in the Canadian Constitution of the Canadian government, one of our is the peace, order, and good government. We don't hear it too much, but it actually, everybody who's been to law school and everybody who's in government understands that this is the theme, whereas other countries have other objectives. Ours seems to be very Canadian, calm, steady as she goes. Is it possible that by pursuing the Kinder Morgan pipeline in this manner, with what I think we've agreed is a flawed NEB process that you've attempted ex post facto to correct?
No, we actually did correct. We did the kinds of things that we now expect on the process. We took the process that under Harper wasn't good enough, we improved it, and through that process, in a hybrid way, we were able to approve the Kinder Morgan pipeline.
Still, the residue of lack of public trust and suspicion, the NEB fell under suspicion over the Energy East pipeline when it was discovered that there had been panelists who were having secret meetings with proponents. These are the things that lead the public not to have confidence. You saw what happened in Nanaimo. The Kinder Morgan pipeline will face over 100 Indigenous communities spanning hundreds of kilometers. People who have no stake really themselves in the outcome of what's going to happen, they are not really going to see substantial benefit. They may see short-term employment.
I think everyone benefits if we reach our climate targets in our Paris targets.
I think that First Nations people along that pipeline route may feel that that's a pretty vague benefit to them.
Well, I don't know. I've spoken with a lot of Indigenous communities who are very concerned about both the jobs that their kids are going to get and the protection of the natural environment that surrounds us, and making sure we are actually able to reach our Paris targets, making sure we actually have a plan to reduce our carbon emissions is something that just about all Canadians care for, including Indigenous Canadians.
And if I may, I do think that whether you think that that's going to be satisfactory or not to them, you will face protests. You will face protests as the pipeline proceeds into the largest urban population in Western Canada. 2.5 million people live in the Metro Vancouver region. This pipeline is going to go right through an urban population.
But it already does.
It already does. But
and it has for the past, 30 years.
I'm not going there with respect, Mr. Prime Minister. I'm talking about the number of people who are going to be out protesting. I'm talking about the issue of, there are a number of ways that we in government have objectives. There are how we form objectives, and then there's the question of, is it politically achievable? And what I'm asking you is, are you leading Canada into a quagmire? Are we going to see a combination of an Oka and a war in the woods? Vancouver is the birthplace of Greenpeace. This is where Occupy Wall Street started. These are people who know how to draw and drive media attention.
Do you know what people in BC also know how to do? They know how to create responsible resource development that protects our environment. What was achieved in the forestry industry in BC is a good example of getting that balance right. There's still more work to do, but people in BC understand that growing the economy and protecting the environment need to go together, perhaps better than just about anyone else in the country. BCers get that. And what we have said consistently is we get that too. And these decisions all hold together. The decision to approve the twinning of an existing pipeline is an unavoidable element in a national climate change plan. Now, there are parts of that national climate change plan that prairie conservatives don't like. They don't like the national price on carbon. There are parts that certain people in BC don't like. The Kinder Morgan pipeline, for example. There may be other parts that other people have issues with. But my job as a Prime Minister is to hold the country together and do the things that are right for all Canadians. The federal government has responsibility for protecting our oceans. That's why we're putting $1.5 billion into a world-class oceans protection plan that involves Indigenous communities, is investing in the Coast Guard in ways that has never been done before. The federal government has the responsibility for national energy projects that cross borders, provincial borders. That's why we're moving forward on ensuring that that pipeline is built safely and securely. The federal government has national responsibility for environmental issues, and taxation, which is why we're putting in a national price on carbon pollution. You can't have all those things unless you have all those things together. That is the point. My role as Prime Minister is to make those difficult decisions. If this was an easy choice to make, people would be able to make it easily and there'd be support. But there are competing interests in place, and what Canadians entrusted me with as a responsibility is figuring out the best path forward, the path that's going to protect the environment, that's going to ensure that we have jobs while we move forward into a transition off our dependency on fossil fuels, that makes sure that we are creating the kinds of supports that'll protect our marine life and our oceans while reducing climate change. These are all things that go together, and this approach is one that I stand behind as a federal government. Now, various provinces, whether it's Saskatchewan on carbon pricing or BC right now on the pipeline element, can take issue with certain pieces of it, but Saskatchewan's very happy we've approved a pipeline, and BC is very happy we've moved forward on carbon pricing. For political reasons, they can take issue with certain elements of it, but my job as the federal government, as leader of the federal government, is to make sure that the whole thing holds together in Canada and Canadians' best interests. And that's exactly what I'm going to do.
Thank you very much for your time today, Mr. Prime Minister.
What a pleasure, Sam. Thank you.